Hey everyone. So I want to cover a topic in this video that I don't think I've talked about on this channel. I think I made a video about it about a year ago on the Israel 365 news channel, but some news broke the other day that didn't really make the headlines. I could scarcely find any coverage of it, but it's actually pretty significant and I want you to know about it. And we're going to talk about why it's significant, what it means. And it has to do with a House Judiciary Committee investigation of funding sources of some left-wing Israeli NGOs. And you might wonder, why is that an American issue? But take a look at this headline. This is not from any news source. This is from the House Judiciary Committee website. New memo reveals Biden-Harris administration misused taxpayer dollars to fund radical anti-Israel protests and terrorist-linked NGOs. It's dated May 29th, just a couple of days ago, Washington, D.C. Today, the House Judiciary Committee released a memo titled The Biden-Harris Administration's Funding of Anti-Netanyahu Non-Governmental Organizations, Part 2, detailing a continued pattern of the Biden-Harris administration's neglect and misuse of taxpayer dollars through U.S. Agency for International Development, that's USAID, the State Department, and other federal agencies that were used to directly and indirectly fund the efforts of anti-Netanyahu organizations and terrorist groups. Not just anti-Netanyahu organizations, but also terrorist groups. There is also evidence that U.S. nonprofits may be violating their 501c3 provisions of U.S. law by funding radical anti-Israel groups and protests against the Israeli government. They had released their first memo in July 2025. So I'm not going to keep reading from here. I just want to tell you what this is all about. So let's start with the background. In 2023, before October 7th, before the war, before everything, Israel was consumed by the biggest protest movement. Well, not the biggest protest movement. It was the loudest protest movement in its history because frankly, the right-wing protests against the peace process, against the Oslo Accords way back in the 90s were probably way bigger than this. But it was a pretty big protest movement. Week after week, there were thousands of Israelis in the streets. The media was building it up to make it seem bigger than it was, although it was quite large. It went on for 39 consecutive weeks. If you saw the images, you probably heard that Israelis were protesting to save democracy, right? That was the framing. The Netanyahu government had proposed what it called judicial reform. And the left in Israel, and pretty much every Western media outlet, treated this as some existential threat to Israeli democracy, that Netanyahu was trying to usurp powers. Now, I'm not going to get into the full debate about judicial reform right now. It's a whole other video. It's beyond the scope of this conversation. But here's what you need to know for the context of this one. Israel's Supreme Court, unlike virtually any other court in any Western democracy, in any free democracy, had arrogated for itself, it had given itself the power, of powers that no Supreme Court really has. It took these powers for itself over the course of decades, the power to strike down laws without any case being brought, the power to overturn any government decision, again, without anyone bringing a case. The government makes a decision, they don't like it, they could overturn it. The Knesset passes a law, they don't like it. And it's not like we have a constitution. They would veto cabinet appointments. And I'm not saying that, of course you have the concept of being constitutional, but that's not what this was about. Even if the cabinet appointment or the government decision or the law did not contradict any existing law, there were no checks on that power. The reform, and I know it sounds a little extreme, but trust me. So the whole judicial reform thing was an attempt to rein in the power of the judiciary. Suffice it to say, and this is not, even the other side will agree, Israel's judiciary has far, far more power than any judiciary in the Western world. I mean, it's too much. So reasonable people can disagree about the details, but the idea that this was like a coup or a threat to democracy was really just political rhetoric. So you had this massive protest movement going on. It was funded by organizations, and it was run out of a headquarters coordinated across the country And it was aimed at one thing, which was bringing down the Netanyahu government before it could pass this judicial reform agenda. Now, here's where the House Judiciary Committee comes in. Starting in March 2025, so not long after Trump assumed office, the committee, chaired by Jim Jordan, Representative Jim Jordan, began investigating whether American taxpayer dollars had been funneled through NGOs to help fund those protests. They sent letters to 6 organizations and demanded documents. They've now reviewed over 1,200 documents, and they just released their second major memo since they started this, dated May 29th, just a couple days ago. And what they found is extraordinary. Here's the basic money trail. Okay, follow this carefully because it matters. The Biden administration, through USAID and the State Department and the Department of Defense, gave tens of millions of dollars to a U.S. nonprofit called the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Over $50 million was given to them in the period that they examined. Now, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors then donated money to the PEF Israel Endowment Funds, which is a US-based nonprofit that acts as a pass-through for donations to Israeli organizations. PEF then donated approximately $18 million to an organization called Blue White Future, which the committee describes as the group that literally, quote, funded and ran the headquarters for the coalition of groups opposing judicial reform. Blue White Future. The headquarters of the entire protest movement was funded downstream from US taxpayer dollars. Now, the organizations involved will tell you, and this is their legal defense, that the American government money went to other projects, or it didn't even go to Israel. USAID funded media programs in Africa and Asia. The State Department funded refugee programs. None of it was earmarked for Israeli protests. And now technically that's true. But the thing is, and the committee explains this in the memo, is that money is fungible. When you give an organization government money for Project A, that frees up other money to go to Project B. Like the new funding stream allows them to do things they couldn't do before. So the fact that the direct grant wasn't labeled fund the anti-Netanyahu protests is legally convenient, but substantively irrelevant. It gets worse. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund received 500, so this is a separate, so you have the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and then you have the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund is a separate charity that received $557,000 from Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, the same organization that was getting tens of millions in US government grants. So taxpayer money flowed into Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors passed money to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund then gave money directly to left-wing groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which after October 7th released a statement blaming Israel for the Hamas massacre. Right? They also funded the New Israel Fund, which bankrolled groups that started the first protests against the Netanyahu government, against judicial reform in January 2023. They gave money to an organization called Alliance for Global Justice, which in turn funded Samidun, which the US Treasury has designated as a front group for the terrorist organization, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's a full-throated terrorist group in the Middle East. So we're not just talking about funding political protests in a foreign country. We're talking about a chain that connects American taxpayer dollars through multiple layers of nonprofits to groups with ties to designated terrorist organizations. This is all in this Judiciary Committee report that was released a couple of days ago. You can download it online. Now, the committee also found that there was a group, an Israeli group called the Movement for Quality Government. Okay, they were one of the lead organizers of these anti-judiciary reform protests. The Movement for Quality Government. They received a $42,000 grant directly from the State Department under Biden. And that grant explicitly was for, quote, civic activism training program, in Israeli high schools. And what they found is that they were teaching Israeli teenagers to distrust their government and, in their words, to become key activists and revealers of corruption. And this was paid for by you, the American taxpayer, if you're an American taxpayer. Now, let me tell you why I think this matters beyond the legal and financial details. Before October 7th, the protest movement was portrayed as this spontaneous, organic uprising of the Israeli people against a dangerous government. Like that, right? That's how they sold it to the world. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets. Surely this is the authentic voice of Israeli civil society, right? Never mind that the electorate in Israel is overwhelmingly right-wing, and that's why we haven't had a left-wing prime minister in decades. Not gonna have one anytime soon, in my opinion. Anyway, what this report shows is that the infrastructure behind those protests, the headquarters, the funding networks, the organizing apparatus, was substantially bankrolled by American money flowing through a web of left-wing nonprofits with ideological agendas. And the Biden administration, which openly said that, which openly called for Netanyahu's removal. I mean, Biden openly said this. He openly called for Netanyahu to be replaced. The Biden administration was feeding money into that flow. Now, in the report put out by the House Judiciary Committee, you can see they have charts that track the flow of money. So you can actually see many more details than I'm sharing with you here. But they were not promoting democracy. Okay, what you had here, very simple, was a foreign government, the US government, using taxpayer dollars to affect Israeli domestic politics. That's what this was. And here's what makes it even more damning. The Israeli protest leaders were openly asking for this interference. Here, let me show you something. Look at this. This is a piece in The Hill from July 2023, a few months before October 7th, right, during the height of all these protests, right? The heads of the Blue and White Future, the organization that ran the protest headquarters, they published an op-ed in The Hill calling on the Biden administration to refuse to meet with Netanyahu so that Netanyahu could, in their words, learn the consequences of pursuing judicial reform. You understand what's happening here? They were calling on the leadership of a foreign country to punish the prime minister of Israel, to refuse meetings with him, to meddle in our domestic affairs because of this dispute over judicial reform, a domestic issue. They were not hiding it. They were publicly inviting a foreign government to use diplomatic pressure to bring down their own prime minister. And Democratic leaders obliged. As I said, Biden called for Netanyahu to step down or called for him to be replaced. He said Netanyahu cannot continue down this road. And then after October 7th, we saw more of this. In March 2024, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer went to the floor of the Senate and called on Israel to hold new elections and remove Netanyahu from power. Right? He actually, think about that. He stood in the floor of the Senate, a senator in the United States, and called on a different democratic country to hold elections, even though the government hadn't fallen, it wasn't time for elections, to hold elections to remove Netanyahu from power. The highest ranking Jewish elected official in America using the Senate floor to demand regime change of a Democratic ally. Even Mitch McConnell, I'm not a fan of his, and he's no fan of Netanyahu. Even Mitch McConnell pushed back because he doesn't even like Netanyahu, but he pushed back saying, Israel's not a colony of America whose leaders serve at the pleasure of the party in power in Washington. So let's be clear about what the full picture looks like based on this memo that was released. And again, there was an earlier memo, a part 1 that was released in the previous May. You can download both documents at the House Judiciary website. The Israeli left publicly invited American interference in domestic politics. The Biden administration funded the protest infrastructure through NGOs. And Democratic leaders, from the president to the Senate Majority Leader, publicly called for Prime Minister Netanyahu's removal. Okay, this was out in the open. You can't even call it a covert operation. The only thing we didn't know until now was how much American taxpayer money was flowing through the pipes to make it happen. And I want to pause here for a moment, because I think there's a really profound irony in all of this that I think we need to say out loud. You know, one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in the world, one that's been around for decades, and it's become now like, you know, an accepted way of thinking, is that Israel controls the United States government, right? That the Jewish state pulls the strings in Washington, that American politicians are puppets of Israeli interests, right? You hear this all the time in social media and from politicians. Now, what this investigation actually reveals is the opposite, actually. It was the American government that was funding a political operation inside Israel to remove Israel's duly elected prime minister. This wasn't Israel manipulating America. This was America manipulating Israel. Right? The interference in our electoral politics was coming from the United States. Remember Russiagate? Remember the accusations that Russia's involved in trying to influence American politics? You actually had the United States actually doing that to Israel. The people who spent years screaming about Israeli control of Washington were all silent. I haven't heard them say anything about this, about Washington trying to control Israel. Think about how we would react if Americans discovered that a foreign government had funneled tens of millions of dollars, and think about the scale. Israel's a tiny country. So the numbers I mentioned here are you have to inflate them considering the fact that Israel's a teeny tiny country. But imagine if millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars were flowing through nonprofits to fund, I don't know, Black Lives Matter or the Tea Party. It doesn't matter which side you're on, whichever side. But that it was coming from foreign government, foreign taxpayer dollars, foreign government money was coming in. And there have been such accusations, and it's scandalous if it's true, right? The outrage is in place. The idea that a foreign power was trying to shape American political outcomes through NGO funding would be considered an attack on American sovereignty, wouldn't it? Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened here, except it was America doing it to Israel. And here's the part that I think everyone's missing. America does run influence operations. And we could argue philosophically about, well, whether running an influence operation in a country that is a dictatorship, and if you believe philosophically in democracy, in the importance of the consent of the governed, so it is true. I mean, you can make the argument that non-democratic dictatorships are not legitimate. You can make that philosophical argument, that moral argument. And maybe then there's room to say that we should go in and influence things to make life better for people who are not living with freedoms. But Israel is a democracy. It is a free country. It's the Middle East's only functioning democracy. And a sitting American president used the machinery of foreign aid to try to take down the elected government of Israel because he disagreed with their domestic policy agenda. Think about that. Anyone who cares about democratic norms should be concerned about this, regardless of where you stand on the particular issue of judicial reform. Anyway, the investigation is still ongoing. More documents are coming. This is only part 2. Some of these organizations are still refusing to comply. That's also in the report here. But what we already know is pretty damning. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. I know it's a little bit out of the box, a little bit different than what we usually talk about, but it's a very important story that it got almost no attention. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So thank you. Please like, share, subscribe, do all that great stuff. And drop a comment. Let me know what you thought of this, what you think of this issue. God bless.